Hello, everybody. I think we're going to get started. If you could just let me know if you can hear my voice and if you can see my screen. That would be great. Are you seeing optimism? Okay, excellent. That's what we want. In the least attached way imaginable. Okay, so I think we're going to get started. Yeah, welcome. So we are talking about optimism today. And we'll see where that takes us. So when times are tough, we are constantly encouraged to be optimistic. Often the image of a glass like this one comes to mind. The question is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? It is presented as a simple litmus test when it comes to optimism. First, you get your label. If you say half full, you are optimistic. If you say half empty, you are pessimistic. Then you get your judgment. Half full, good, optimistic. Half empty, bad, pessimistic. Now, one needn't be a great philosopher or logistician to see that the glass is both half empty and half full. That is the simple truth of the situation. If we see the situation clearly, we see that. We'll get back to that, the truth. But for now, let's stay with optimism. So in the instance of the glass being half full, the ability to see our inclinations toward the positive or negative and shift our perspective at will allows us to see the truth that the answer to the question is, it is both half empty and half full. We are taught that it is better to say half full, to be optimistic, which is inherently better. But the truth is that both are true. So our perception, our stories, and our mental habits are what will make us choose either of the answers, unless we can allow them to fall away and see the truth. So what is optimism? What do we mean by being optimistic? Optimism is an inclination to put the most favorable construction upon actions and events, or to anticipate the best possible outcome. So this definition has two parts, present and the future. How we are experiencing the moment-to-moment passing of moments and events, and how we view the future, both specifically and generally. So in the present, an optimistic view would put the most favorable construction upon what is happening. In the future, we would anticipate the best possible outcome. Now, optimism sometimes gets a bad rap. Some see optimism as being unrealistic, but I'm not sure that has to necessarily be the case. Does optimism have to dismiss reality? Perhaps optimism has more to do with a cultivated openness to the full spectrum of experience and possibility than it does with blind adherence to a positive outlook or outcome. Optimism doesn't say you only see the variable, the favorable. It's an inclination toward it. But it is an inclination toward the favorable. So how do we reconcile optimism with equanimity? The origin of the word optimism is the French word optimisme from the Latin optimum, which means the best. Some who have discussed equanimity as much as we have in this group may experience a nagging sense that there is something un-Buddhist about the goal of orienting ourselves toward the favorable when experiencing life. To review briefly, equanimity is one of the 4 sublime states, or Brahma-viharas. It is the balanced acceptance of all experience, favorable and unfavorable, desirable and undesirable. So the idea of leaning intentionally towards seeing the positive, the favorable, and the desirable seems a little un-Buddhist. Now, as some of you know, equanimity is a topic of particular interest to me. And while I will continue to ponder optimism and equanimity on my own time, I'd like not to go too far down this particular rabbit hole in this talk. Rather, I hope that today I will make a case that optimism and equanimity are not mutually exclusive. Equanimity is both dependent on seeing clearly without delusion, and it assists us in seeing clearly without delusion. I posit that practicing optimism enables us to see clearly, and when practiced mindfully, can support our practice of equanimity. Thich Nhat Hanh said, "To think in terms of either pessimism or optimism oversimplifies the truth. The problem is to see reality as it is." So in light of my attempts to reconcile optimism and equanimity, I propose a reframing from optimism as a character trait or goal to optimism as a practice. With friendliness in each moment and when pondering the future, we might notice negativity and intentionally shift our perspective toward optimism and observe what happens. In general, we might cultivate the friendliness, which is the first step of practicing metta, loving kindness. And whether in each moment or when pondering the future, we might notice negativity and experiment with intentionally shifting our perspective toward optimism and positivity, and simply observe what happens next. Winston Churchill said, "The pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty." If we read this quote as being less focused on the labels of pessimist and optimist, and more on the practice of shifting perspectives and seeing all that is visible to us in a given situation, we move away from the idea of optimism as a goal or a character trait and toward optimism as a practice. We are talking about a shift in orientation in relation to what is. So let's take a look at some of the benefits of practicing optimism. Through practicing optimism, we may help rid ourselves of the 3 poisons as named by the Buddha. greed, hatred, and delusion. When we practice optimism, we see all we have. We naturally develop a greater appreciation for everything we have. This reduces greed and the longing for more. When we practice optimism, we see the best in others. We naturally develop a greater compassion for those around us, even when their actions are undesirable to us. This reduces hatred and the desire to harm others. And when we practice optimism, we see the full spectrum of possibility in any situation. We notice tendencies and habits toward negativity and pessimism, which limit possibility. This reduces delusion. There are also emotional and physical health benefits. Studies show that optimists feel and are healthier, are more likely to be centenarians, live till 100 or past, experience less stress, and are better at bouncing back, more resilient. The Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada says that a positive mindset is associated with better health and a lower chance of disease. A review of 15 studies with over 200,000 participants found a 35% lower chance of getting heart disease and a 14% lower chance of an early death in people who were optimists. So with all these benefits, why do some of us struggle with pessimism and negativity? Let's look at some of the obstacles to optimism. And we'll look at each one. But social stigma and patterns, media, habitual mental activity, and our friend negativity bias. So social stigma and patterns. Sharon Salzberg tells a funny story. It was when she returned from India and had started writing about loving kindness, metta. She said she found that in New York, especially, this was back in the 70s, people thought that happy people were stupid. She said, as soon as you opened your mouth and said something really happy, people would kind of look at you as if you didn't have a brain in your head. Sean Anker in the Harvard Business Review actually said, I believe we have a cultural assumption that happy people are anti-intellectual, delusional, or shallow. In some social circles, the main topic of conversation is complaining, and it can be contagious. Even if the conversation begins constructive, it often deteriorates into a complaint fest, during which one might be ostracized to some degree if they interject anything positive or try to steer the conversation in a more positive direction. The media. It has been said that bad news sells because the amygdala is always looking for something to fear. This ancient part of the brain is hardwired to be on guard. If it bleeds, it leads, is the saying. Since every TV news show's job is to deliver your eyes to their advertisers, the negative stories reign and we remain glued to the programming. We'll look more closely at negativity bias and our survival mechanisms in a moment, but simply in terms of the media. It is not your imagination that most news outlets skew toward the negative. The name of the game in terms of media is eyeballs on the screen or paper, and bad news keeps them there for evolutionary reasons. And this goes for non-news media as well. Most quality programming has a negative tone to it. Now we'll move on to habitual mental activity. So what I'm referring to as simple is the simple truth from the Buddha that whatever a monk keeps pursuing with his thinking and pondering, that becomes the inclination of his awareness. So the mental habits toward negativity will continue the more that we think negatively. It's that simple. Trauma brings a new wrinkle into the picture. Lower levels of dispositional optimism, so a disposition toward optimism, are associated with stage of affective disorders like depression and bipolar disorder, even after remission, and a history of childhood emotional maltreatment. So in other words, people who have had depression, bipolar disorder, or childhood trauma show lower levels of optimism, even if they're in remission. And now we turn to negativity bias. It seems to me that many talks at sanghas and many news stories are focusing on negativity bias these days. It has worked its way into a more general pool of knowledge. And the basic idea is that the brain is like Velcro for negative experiences, but Teflon for positive ones. The result is tilted against lasting contentment and fulfillment. This is Rick Hanson's simple summary of the idea that dangerous thoughts and sensations are dominant in our brains. They stick to us. But there's another part of negativity bias that isn't discussed that much, and that's generalization. Now, there's different kinds of generalization, all of them helpful to us. As young children, we learn to generalize in order to develop language and in order to develop our concepts of groupings of objects and ideas. For example, I'll just give you a quick example. Children are born with this innate process of generalizing. An experience with one ball leads the child to identify other ball-shaped objects as ball, whether or not they are balls, oranges, grapefruits, other things. They will not label the bat as a ball, because that's not the way they generalize, even though the bat is related to the ball in the game. And through this process of generalization and then correction, we start to hone in on the specificity of language and objects and concepts. Now, generalization also has a strong survival goal and purpose. Way, way, way back when, if we saw a plant which caused somebody near us to get sick, it would not serve us to simply believe that that particular plant on that particular day was what caused the problem. We would generalize so that any plant that looked like that plant would also be off limits to us. And that's fear generalization. So it occurs when a person associates fears learned in the past through classical conditioning to similar situations, events, people, and objects in the present. And this is important for the survival of the organism. Humans and animals need to be able to assess aversive situations and respond appropriately based on generalizations made from past experiences. So that was a lot. But I've intentionally left us with negativity bias as the last one, because this obstacle to optimism is hardwired into us, and it's going to take some practice to wiggle that wiring a little bit, maintaining our safety, but not being ruled by it. This scholar offers us this statement about the Buddha's view. The Buddha's view on positive thinking was that if it violates reality, it's worthless. Just as you can't make a boulder rise into the air by means of wishful thinking, so you can't experience happiness unless you actually do the things that lead to happiness, such as living ethically. So we're going to move on now to some ways of cultivating and practicing optimism. So starting with what we can do while we're meditating, we can practice noticing what is present in the moment, including optimism and pessimism, and notice which thoughts are most compelling. Really start to get to know our patterns. We can practice choosing where we rest our awareness. Practice sitting with optimistic thoughts and pessimistic thoughts, noticing how each feels in the body. Just like with sounds, we notice a dominant sound, but that doesn't mean there aren't any other sounds. We practice noticing greater breadth of experience. We notice a dominant emotional state, but that doesn't mean that the other emotions aren't present. So when we can practice optimism and notice when optimistic thoughts arise, and yet still be aware of the negative thoughts, we are not destroying negative thoughts. We are noticing them and remaining detached from them. Continuing on the cushion, we can practice loving kindness, metta. This will allow us to practice assuming that tone of friendliness. And it also provides the opportunity to practice separating or uncoupling our responses from the desirability or undesirability of a thought, a feeling, or sensation. Off the cushion, we can try to balance good news and bad news. Add good news sources, Yes Magazine and the Good News Network. We could seek out less sensational news sources. The Atlantic and New Republic are two examples. We don't have to disengage from news in order to remain optimistic, but we can shift our sources. Perhaps you've noticed, as I have, an attraction for more negative entertainment choices. And if you have, maybe you could make a point of mixing it up a bit. And given the negativity bias, if I were a doctor, I would probably prescribe 2 positives to 1 negative. Just sprinkling in 1 positive news source or 1 positive entertainment choice is probably not going to do that much to shift things. So we want to do this with some intentionality. And here are just some examples: nature shows, cooking shows, sci-fi, PG dramas, right? So we want to mix in some N with an E with your Ozarks. And finally, share good news with others and get active with good news groups. Mutual Aid New York City, right here in the city, links people with something to give with people in need of something. Grassroots, fairly recent, and flourishing. The Energy News Network, Pioneers, Living on Earth, all of these websites have some sort of an activist component to them, some pretty big A activist and some little a, but they all give you something to do, which will help you with your optimism. You may have seen this famous quote from Fred Rogers. When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. When Mr. Rogers said, look for the helpers, this is like a meditation. We shift our awareness to those doing good. And this is an invitation to practice optimism. And I think we have some time for some Q&A.